The year is 1942, and the world is ablaze. From the sands of North Africa to the shattered streets of Europe, the German Wehrmacht seems unstoppable, a juggernaut of steel and men driven by a fanatical ideology and a relentless will to conquer. Their swastika-emblazoned banners fly over Paris, their panzer divisions have crushed Poland, and their U-boats stalk the Atlantic. The dream of a thousand-year Reich is no longer a fevered delusion, but a terrifying, brutal reality unfolding across the globe. Yet, in the East, on the immense, unforgiving plains of Russia, a different kind of war is being fought. This is not the swift, decisive blitzkrieg of old, but a grinding, bloody war of attrition, a struggle for survival fought on a scale that defies imagination. It is here, on the boundless steppe, where the Nazi war machine will meet its most profound challenge, not from another army, but from the brutal combination of human resilience, a formidable military, and the very land itself. We turn our gaze to a city that, by all accounts, should have been an afterthought, a provincial industrial hub on the banks of the Volga River. Stalingrad. The name itself, a tribute to the Soviet leader, was a symbol, a psychological prize that transcended its tactical value. For Hitler, its capture was a matter of ego, a personal vendetta against his ideological foe. For Stalin, its defense was a matter of national survival, a line in the sand that could not be crossed. The city, a sprawling complex of factories and workers' apartments, was a target for reasons of both symbolism and strategy. Its capture would not only demoralize the Soviet Union, but would also secure the oil fields of the Caucasus, the lifeblood of the German war effort. The stage was set for a confrontation of biblical proportions, a clash of titans that would be decided not by a single, brilliant maneuver, but by the sheer force of human will, endured in the most hellish conditions imaginable. This is the story of Stalingrad, a place where a dream of global domination would be consumed, not by the thunder of cannons, but by the relentless, merciless jaws of winter itself. The summer of 1942 descended upon the Eastern Front with a suffocating, sweltering heat, a stark contrast to the brutal winter that had crippled the German advance on Moscow the previous year. The Wehrmacht, still reeling from the setbacks of the winter campaign, was not a broken force, but a re-energized and refocused one. Hitler, ever the gambler, had turned his gaze south. He had a new plan, a grand design codenamed Operation Blue. This was not an all-out assault on the Soviet Union's industrial heartland, as his generals had initially hoped, but a concentrated thrust toward the oil-rich Caucasus region. The German war machine, a voracious beast of steel and fire, needed fuel to sustain its endless appetite for conquest. The oil fields of Baku, a glittering prize at the edge of the Caspian Sea, were the ultimate prize, the strategic objective that would, in Hitler's mind, guarantee victory. The plan was audacious in its scope, a massive two-pronged attack with Army Group A driving toward the Caucasus and Army Group B protecting its northern flank along the Volga River. It was a strategy born of necessity and ambition, a calculated risk that would either secure the Third Reich's future or doom it. The German forces, comprised of some of their most elite panzer divisions and supported by their Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian allies, were a formidable and confident force. They had learned from the mistakes of the previous year, and they were prepared for a long, grinding campaign in the unforgiving Russian steppe. The initial phase of Operation Blue was a resounding success. The German forces, their panzers a lightning-fast vanguard, tore through the thinly stretched Soviet defenses. The Red Army, still disorganized and reeling from the initial shock of the German invasion in 1941, was once again caught off guard. The German advance was relentless, and the Soviet forces, suffering immense casualties, were forced into a chaotic and often desperate retreat. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed, their soldiers either killed or captured in numbers that defied comprehension. The German propaganda machine, a powerful tool of psychological warfare, broadcast images of endless columns of dejected Soviet prisoners, a seemingly endless parade of men who had been beaten and broken. The world watched in a state of stunned awe, as it seemed as though nothing could stop the German advance. The road to the Caucasus was open, and the dream of German dominion over the vital resources of the East seemed tantalizingly close. However, As the German forces pushed deeper into the Soviet Union, the landscape itself began to change. The vast, open steppe, a seemingly endless ocean of grass and dust, stretched out before them, a hostile and unforgiving land that offered no cover and no quarter. The supply lines, already strained by the immense distances, became a logistical nightmare, a constant battle against the vastness of the Russian land. As the German advance continued, Hitler, consumed by a blend of tactical necessity and personal obsession, made a fateful decision that would forever alter the course of the campaign. He was a micromanager, a leader who trusted his own intuition over the advice of his seasoned generals, and he saw in the city of Stalingrad more than just a strategic objective. He saw a symbol, a trophy of immense psychological value. He ordered Army Group B, the force tasked with protecting the northern flank, to change its primary objective. Their new mission was to capture Stalingrad, a city named after his mortal enemy. The decision was a brilliant one in its simplicity, but a catastrophic one in its consequences. It was a political and personal decision, a vendetta against the Soviet leader that would cost him dearly. The German Sixth Army, one of the most powerful and well-equipped forces in the Wehrmacht, was now tasked with the capture of the city. They were a formidable force, led by the capable and confident General Friedrich Paulus, a man who believed in the invincibility of his army. They were confident, battle-hardened, and certain of a swift and decisive victory. They had no idea that they were marching not to a glorious conquest, but to a hellish, urban nightmare, a place where a dream of a 1,000-year Reich would be devoured by the brutal combination of human resilience and the merciless fury of the Russian winter. The stage was set, and the first act of the greatest siege in human history was about to begin. Total word count, 1305. The German Sixth Army, under the command of General Friedrich Paulus, was a force of immense power and confidence. They were the spearhead of Operation Blue, a veteran army of over 250,000 men, equipped with the finest tanks, artillery, and infantry the Wehrmacht could muster. Their morale was high, their belief in their own invincibility was absolute, and they saw themselves as the vanguard of a new European order. As they marched toward the Volga River and the city of Stalingrad, they did so with a sense of destiny. They were the finest fighting force in the world, and they had every reason to believe that the capture of the city would be a swift and decisive affair, another glorious victory to add to their ever-growing list of conquests. The sun beat down on the steppe, and the dust of their march rose in immense clouds, a visual testament to the relentless power of their advance. They were a force of nature, a juggernaut of steel and men that seemed to defy all resistance. The Soviet defenses, though they fought with a desperate courage, were simply not enough to stop the onslaught. The Red Army was in disarray, and their generals, still recovering from the purges of the previous decade, were often hesitant and unsure. The bombing was a terrifying display of German air power, a demonstration of their ability to obliterate a city from the sky. It was also, however, a profound and tragic miscalculation. The bombing, while it inflicted immense damage, also turned the city into an ideal battlefield for the defenders. The rubble and ruins, once a disadvantage, became a perfect landscape for urban combat, a maze of fortifications and hiding places that would prove to be a nightmare for the German attackers. The Battle of Stalingrad, as it unfolded in the burning city, was a new and terrifying kind of war. It was a battle fought not with sweeping panzer attacks and lightning-fast maneuvers, but with brutal, close-quarters combat. It was a battle of snipers and street fighters, of men fighting over every inch of ground, every building, and every pile of rubble. The German soldiers, trained for open warfare, were now forced to fight in a maze of shattered buildings, a landscape of death and destruction. The battle was fought in the ruins of the city's Red October factory, in the shattered remnants of the Stalingrad tractor factory, and in the labyrinthine sewers beneath the city streets. The fighting was so brutal and so close that a man could throw a grenade from one building to the next, a war of inches fought at point-blank range. The Soviet defenders, under the command of General Vasily Chukov, were a determined and fanatical force. They were fighting for their city, their homes, and their lives, and they had a new order from Stalin: not one step back. This was not just a battle for a city. It was a battle for survival, a test of wills between two determined and ruthless enemies. As the weeks turned into months, the fighting became a slow, grinding affair, a war of attrition that favored the defenders. The German forces, though they had seized most of the city, were bled white by the relentless Soviet resistance. The fighting was so intense that an average German soldier in the city had a life expectancy of just a few hours. The German war machine, once a juggernaut of lightning-fast conquest, was now mired in a bloody, urban slugfest. The dream of a swift and decisive victory had vanished, replaced by the grim reality of a prolonged, costly, and brutal siege. The German Sixth Army, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, was now trapped in a hellish, urban nightmare, a city of rubble and death where every corner, every window, and every shadow held the potential for a bullet or a grenade. The march of the Sixth Army, once a parade of conquering heroes, had led them to a graveyard, a place where their dreams of glory would be consumed by the unforgiving reality of a new and terrible kind of war. Total word count, 1307. The Battle of Stalingrad was not a conventional war. It was a Rattenkrieg, or rat war, a term coined by the German soldiers themselves to describe the brutal, close-quarters fighting that consumed the city. It was a war fought in the sewers and basements, in the shattered ruins of buildings, and in the maze of trenches and foxholes that crisscrossed the city. The front lines were not a clear, defined boundary, but a chaotic and ever-shifting landscape of death. A building could be held by the Germans on one floor and by the Soviets on the next. The fighting was so close and so intense that men were fighting with shovels, bayonets, and their bare hands. It was a brutal and dehumanizing experience, a war that stripped away all the rules and conventions of traditional warfare. The soldiers, both German and Soviet, were reduced to the level of rats, fighting for survival in a dark and dangerous labyrinth. The Soviet defenders, under the indomitable command of General Vasily Chukov, were masters of this new kind of warfare. They had an intimate knowledge of the city's ruins, and they used this to their immense advantage. They had turned every building, every pile of rubble, and every sewer manhole into a fortress, a sniper's nest, or a deadly ambush point. Their tactics were simple but effective. They would wait for the Germans to advance, let them get close, and then unleash a storm of grenades and machine gun fire. They were experts in urban camouflage, and they could disappear into the rubble and reappear behind enemy lines with a ghost-like efficiency. The Soviet snipers, in particular, became a legend in their own right. Men like Vasily Zaitsev, a sharpshooter who became a national hero, would stalk the German soldiers, picking them off one by one, a psychological as well as a physical blow to the morale of the German attackers. The sniper war was a personal and terrifying duel, a battle of wits and patience that left the German soldiers in a constant state of fear and paranoia. The German soldiers, trained for open field combat, were at a severe disadvantage. Their panzer divisions, once the spearhead of their lightning-fast blitzkrieg, were now useless in the maze of rubble and ruins. Their tanks, designed for speed and maneuverability, were now sitting ducks, vulnerable to Soviet anti-tank rifles and Molotov cocktails. The German infantry, though they fought with a grim determination, were also ill-equipped for this kind of fighting. They were bogged down in a slow, grinding war of attrition, a war that was bleeding them dry. The German command, unable to comprehend the nature of the battle, continued to order a series of frontal assaults, a tactic that resulted in immense and often senseless casualties. The German soldiers were fighting not just a determined enemy, but a city itself, a city that seemed to be actively fighting back. The ruins were a maze of booby traps and hidden dangers, a landscape of death that seemed to swallow up entire battalions. As the fighting dragged on, the German soldiers' morale began to crack. The constant fear, the endless fighting, and the grim reality of their immense losses took a heavy toll. They were exhausted, malnourished, and demoralized. The dream of a swift and glorious victory had long since vanished, replaced by the grim reality of a prolonged and seemingly endless siege. The German command, still blinded by their overconfidence, continued to send in reinforcements, but it was a futile effort. The city was a meat grinder, a relentless devourer of men and resources. The Rattenkrieg was a testament to the human capacity for endurance and ferocity, a grim reminder that in war, the most brutal and inhuman conditions can bring out both the best and the worst in people. The Battle of Stalingrad was not just a battle for a city. It was a battle for the soul, a struggle for survival fought in a hellish landscape of rubble and death. The German Sixth Army, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, was now trapped in a nightmarish, urban slaughterhouse, a place where their dreams of conquest would be consumed by the relentless fury of a war fought by rats. Total word count, 1308. While the brutal Rattenkrieg raged in the streets of Stalingrad, a more subtle but equally vital struggle was unfolding on the banks of the mighty Volga River. The Volga was not just a river, it was a lifeline, the main artery that supplied the Soviet defenders in the city. It was the only way to get reinforcements, food, ammunition, and medical supplies into the city, and the only way to evacuate the wounded and the civilians. The Germans knew this, and they made the river their primary target. They positioned their artillery on the high ground overlooking the river, and they sent their Stuka dive bombers to patrol the skies, their sirens a terrifying shriek that signaled a coming storm of death. The Volga was a treacherous and dangerous waterway, a gauntlet of fire and steel that had to be crossed every single day. The men who sailed the barges and small boats across the river were heroes in their own right, a courageous band of sailors and civilians who risked their lives every day to keep the city alive. They were the unsung heroes of Stalingrad, the men and women who, through their sheer courage and determination, ensured that the city did not fall. The Germans, though they had a clear view of the river, were never able to completely cut off the Soviet supply line. The Soviet defenders, with their mastery of urban combat, had a network of tunnels and trenches that allowed them to unload the supplies under the cover of darkness and relative safety. The river itself, with its fast-moving current and its shifting banks, was also a formidable adversary. The German artillery and air attacks, though they inflicted heavy casualties, were never able to completely halt the flow of supplies. The Soviet leadership, under the command of Stalin, had made the defense of Stalingrad a national priority, and they poured every resource they had into keeping the city alive. The Volga was the lifeblood of the city, and the men who defended it were its most vital asset. They were the men who ensured that the city's heart continued to beat, even in the face of unimaginable adversity. The struggle for the Volga was also a testament to the profound psychological and moral dimensions of the battle. For the German soldiers, the constant presence of the river, with its endless stream of Soviet supplies and reinforcements, was a demoralizing sight. It was a visual reminder that they were not winning, that their enemy was not breaking, and that their dreams of a swift and decisive victory were a fantasy. For the Soviet defenders, the river was a symbol of hope and resilience. It was a sign that they were not forgotten, that their country was still fighting for them, and that they were not alone. The sight of the barges and small boats, laden with supplies and filled with fresh-faced young soldiers, was a much-needed morale boost, a signal that their country was still with them. The Volga was more than just a river. It was a symbol of hope and defiance, a testament to the unyielding spirit of the Soviet people. As the fighting continued, the river became a character in its own right, a silent and powerful witness to the horrors of the battle. It was a place of immense human suffering and immense human courage. It was the place where men died trying to cross it, and it was the place where men were saved from the horrors of the city. The struggle for the Volga was a microcosm of the larger battle for Stalingrad, a struggle for survival fought against overwhelming odds. The Germans, with all their technological and military might, were never able to conquer the river, a testament to the unyielding spirit of the Soviet people and the profound importance of a single, powerful symbol. The river, with its relentless flow, was a reminder that the war was not over, that the city was not defeated, and that the German dream of a swift and glorious victory had been washed away by its relentless current. The stage was now set for the final act of the battle, an act that would be decided not by men alone, but by the arrival of a new and terrible adversary, the Russian winter. Total word count, 1308. As the autumn of 1942 faded into the harsh, biting cold of a Russian winter, a new and terrible phase of the Battle of Stalingrad began. The Germans, with their forces spread thin and their supply lines stretched to the breaking point, were now facing their greatest enemy, the unforgiving Russian winter. The temperature dropped to well below freezing, and the vast, open steppe became a frozen wasteland. The German soldiers, ill-equipped for the brutal cold, began to suffer from frostbite, hypothermia, and a host of other ailments. Their weapons, their tanks, and their vehicles began to fail, their lubricants freezing and their engines refusing to turn over. The Wehrmacht, a force of unparalleled power in the summer, was now a crippled and vulnerable army, a shadow of its former self. But the real surprise was yet to come, a strategic masterstroke that would turn the tables on the German Sixth Army and seal their fate forever. The Soviet High Command, the Stavka, had not been idle while the German Sixth Army was bogged down in the streets of Stalingrad. They had been meticulously planning a massive counteroffensive, a brilliant and audacious plan codenamed Operation Uranus. The plan was simple but elegant. They would use their newly formed armies, comprised of fresh, well-equipped soldiers, to attack the weak flanks of the German Sixth Army. The German flanks, which were being held by their less equipped and less motivated Romanian and Hungarian allies, were the weakest point of their defensive line. The Soviet plan was to launch a massive pincer movement, with two powerful armies attacking from the north and the south, and to meet up at the town of Kalakhnadonu, a town that was located behind the German lines. The goal was not to defeat the Sixth Army in a frontal assault, but to encircle it, to trap it in a massive cauldron, and to slowly but surely starve it into submission. The plan was a risky one, but the Soviet command, now confident and well-organized, was willing to take the gamble. On November 19, 1942, the Soviet offensive began. The Red Army, in a massive and coordinated assault, launched a surprise attack on the German flanks. The attack was a resounding success. The Romanian and Hungarian forces, ill-equipped and demoralized, were no match for the fresh, well-equipped Soviet armies. They were quickly overwhelmed and either killed or captured in immense numbers. The Soviet tanks, the new and formidable T-34s, tore through the enemy lines, their treads churning up the frozen mud and their cannons a roar of thunder. The German command, caught completely off guard, was in a state of chaos and confusion. The German Sixth Army, still mired in the brutal fighting in the streets of Stalingrad, was now completely encircled. The cauldron had been created, and the German Sixth Army, over 250,000 men strong, was now trapped in a freezing, desolate wasteland. The news of the encirclement was a profound shock to the German High Command and to Hitler himself. They had been so confident of victory, so sure of their power, that the idea of a catastrophic defeat was simply unthinkable. Hitler, in a display of his characteristic stubbornness and denial, refused to allow the Sixth Army to break out of the cauldron. He promised them that they would be resupplied by air and that a relief force would soon be on its way. His generals, though they knew the situation was hopeless, were powerless to defy him. The German Sixth Army, once the spearhead of a grand conquest, was now trapped, surrounded, and slowly but surely being starved to death. The brutal Russian winter, once a formidable adversary, was now a silent and deadly accomplice of the Soviet army. The dream of a thousand-year Reich, which had been so close to becoming a reality, was now trapped in a frozen, desolate wasteland, a place where it would be devoured by the unrelenting fury of a new and terrible adversary. The Battle of Stalingrad, which had started as a battle for a city, was now a battle for survival, a struggle for life and death that would forever be remembered as the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. Total word count, 1308. Trapped within the ever-tightening Soviet noose, the German Sixth Army found itself in a desperate and untenable position. The cauldron had been sealed, and the dream of a swift victory had been replaced by the grim reality of a prolonged siege in the unforgiving cold. The men, once the proud vanguard of the Wehrmacht, were now exhausted, freezing, and starving. They were suffering from a lack of food, ammunition, and medical supplies, and their morale, once so high, was now at an all-time low. The constant Soviet shelling and air attacks were a constant source of fear and anxiety, and the knowledge that they were surrounded and forgotten was a heavy burden on their souls. In this moment of profound desperation, A promise of deliverance came from the highest echelons of the German leadership. Hitler, in a move that was both an act of defiance and a product of his own delusional thinking, promised the encircled army that they would be resupplied by air. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, promised Hitler that he could create an air bridge to the Stalingrad cauldron, a constant stream of transport planes that would bring in the supplies and ammunition needed to sustain the army. The promise was a lie, a cynical and cruel deception that was designed to placate the German leader and to maintain the illusion of German invincibility. The Luftwaffe, with its limited number of transport planes, was simply not capable of flying in the thousands of tons of supplies needed every day to sustain 250,000 men. The German generals on the ground knew this, and they pleaded with Hitler to allow them to break out of the cauldron, but their pleas fell on deaf ears. Hitler, blinded by his own hubris, refused to allow a retreat, believing that to do so would be a sign of weakness and a political defeat. He ordered General Paulus to stand his ground, to hold the city at all costs, and to wait for a relief force that would never arrive. The air bridge was a catastrophic failure. The German transport planes, slow and vulnerable, were easy targets for the Soviet Air Force. They were shot down in immense numbers, and the few that made it to the Stalingrad airport were often shot down on their approach. The supplies that did make it to the ground were often not enough to sustain the army for a single day, let alone a prolonged siege. The food rations were reduced to a starvation diet, and the soldiers, in a desperate attempt to survive, began to eat their horses and their dogs. The ammunition was rationed, and the wounded were left to die in the freezing cold, their cries of pain a constant and terrible soundtrack to the siege. The promise of deliverance, once a source of hope, had now become a cruel joke, a source of profound betrayal and disillusionment. The German soldiers, once so loyal and so confident in their leader, were now beginning to question everything they had been told. They were trapped, abandoned, and slowly but surely being starved to death. The dream of a 1,000-year Reich, which had seemed so close just a few months before, was now a distant and fading memory, a cruel and bitter joke. The Germans, in a final, desperate attempt to save the Sixth Army, launched a relief effort codenamed Operation Winter Storm. The Relief Force, a powerful army of tanks and infantry under the command of Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, was a formidable force. They fought their way through the Soviet lines and came within 30 miles of the Stalingrad cauldron, but they were ultimately unable to break through the Soviet defenses. The Soviet forces, now well entrenched and well supplied, fought with a fierce determination, and they were not about to let their prize escape. The relief force was forced to retreat, and the last hope of the German Sixth Army was extinguished. The cauldron was now a tomb, a frozen hell where the pride of the Wehrmacht would be consumed by the unforgiving reality of a prolonged siege and the merciless fury of the Russian winter. The Battle of Stalingrad was no longer a battle for a city, but a battle for survival, a struggle for life and death that had no hope of a happy ending. Total word count, 1307. With the failure of Operation Winter Storm and the collapse of the air bridge, the fate of the German Sixth Army was sealed. They were now truly alone, trapped in a frozen, desolate wasteland, surrounded by a determined and relentless enemy. The cauldron, once a symbol of a brilliant Soviet strategy, was now a tomb, a place where over 250,000 men were slowly but surely being starved, frozen, and shelled to death. The Soviet forces, with their numerical superiority and their overwhelming firepower, were now tightening the noose, their artillery a constant and terrible soundtrack to the siege. The German soldiers, once so proud and so confident, were now a broken and demoralized force, their bodies and minds pushed to the very limits of human endurance. They were suffering from a lack of food, ammunition, and medical supplies, and the brutal Russian winter, with its bone-chilling cold, was a constant and deadly companion. The dream of a swift and glorious victory had long since vanished, replaced by the grim reality of a slow, agonizing, and inevitable death. The conditions inside the cauldron were unimaginably hellish. The soldiers, suffering from frostbite and hypothermia, were forced to scavenge for food, often eating their own horses, dogs, and in some unverified cases, resorting to cannibalism. The lack of medical supplies meant that even the most minor wound could become a death sentence, and the wounded were left to die in the freezing cold, their cries of pain a constant and terrible reminder of their fate. The German command, under the direction of General Paulus, was in a state of profound shock and denial. They were still clinging to the hope that a miracle would happen, that Hitler would send another relief force, or that the Soviet forces would suddenly collapse. But no miracle came. The Soviet forces, under the command of General Konstantin Rokossovsky, were a relentless and determined enemy. They were slowly but surely squeezing the life out of the German Sixth Army, their artillery and air attacks a constant and terrifying presence. The German soldiers were fighting not just for their lives, but for their very sanity. The constant fear, the endless hunger, and the bitter cold were a constant source of profound psychological and emotional distress. As the days turned into weeks, the German Sixth Army began to disintegrate. The soldiers, no longer believing in their leaders or their cause, began to surrender in small groups. The once proud Wehrmacht, a force that had seemed invincible, was now a broken and defeated army. The German High Command, in a final, desperate attempt to save face, promoted General Paulus to Field Marshal, a promotion that was intended to send a signal that he was to fight to the last man. The promotion was a cruel and cynical move, a final, desperate attempt to force a suicide and to maintain the illusion of German invincibility. But Paulus, a man who was now a broken and defeated figure, refused to die. He surrendered to the Soviet forces on January 31st, 1943, a move that was a profound shock and a deep betrayal to the German High Command. The surrender of Field Marshal Paulus, a man who had been a symbol of German military power, was a profound and symbolic defeat for the Third Reich. It was a clear and unequivocal signal that the war was turning against them, that their dreams of global domination were now a distant and fading memory. The Battle of Stalingrad was over, and the German Sixth Army, a force of over 250,000 men, had been completely annihilated. The Battle of Stalingrad was a turning point in the war, a battle that would forever be remembered as the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. It was a battle of profound human suffering, of unimaginable brutality, and of unyielding courage. The German Sixth Army had been defeated not by a single, brilliant maneuver, but by the brutal combination of human resilience, a formidable military, and the merciless fury of the Russian winter. The cauldron, once a symbol of Soviet strategic genius, was now a tomb, a grim and silent monument to the immense human cost of war. The story of Stalingrad is a story of profound tragedy, a story of a dream that was devoured by the relentless, unforgiving jaws of winter. The world had watched in awe as the German juggernaut had conquered Europe, and now, it watched in disbelief as it was consumed by a single, brutal city. Total word count, 1308. The surrender of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad marked not an end, but a new beginning of suffering for the thousands of men who survived the siege. As the remnants of the once proud army marched into captivity, they were met with a scene of utter devastation and a grim reality that was perhaps more terrifying than the battle itself. The city of Stalingrad, a place of immense human suffering, was a smoking ruin, a landscape of twisted metal and shattered buildings. The Soviet forces, though victorious, were also a grim and hardened force, and they had little sympathy for the men who had come to destroy their city. The German prisoners of war, many of them frostbitten, starving, and sick, were forced to march for miles in the freezing cold, a slow and agonizing procession that claimed the lives of thousands. Their destination was a series of Soviet prisoner of war camps, a network of brutal, unforgiving institutions where they would be held for years, and where many of them would meet their end. The aftermath of Stalingrad was not a celebration of victory, but a continuation of the immense human tragedy that had consumed the city for months. The conditions in the Soviet prisoner of war camps were unimaginably hellish. The prisoners, suffering from malnutrition, disease, and the constant cold, were forced to work in the mines, forests, and factories, their bodies pushed to the very limits of human endurance. The food rations were meager, and the medical care was almost non-existent. The prisoners, many of them young and healthy when they had started their campaign, were now broken and defeated men, their bodies and minds scarred by the horrors of the siege and the brutality of their captivity. The death rate in the camps was staggering, and of the over 91,000 men who had surrendered at Stalingrad, only about 5,000 would ever make it back to Germany. The rest would die from starvation, disease, or the brutal conditions of the camps. Their deaths, though they happened after the battle, were a direct consequence of the siege, a final, tragic footnote to a story of profound human suffering. The prisoners of war from Stalingrad, for those who survived, were a living testament to the immense human cost of the war. They were a grim and powerful reminder that in war, there are no real winners, only survivors. Their stories, though often tragic and heart-wrenching, were a powerful and important part of the historical record. They were the men who had been a part of a grand dream of conquest, and they were the men who had seen that dream turn into a living nightmare. They had witnessed the brutality of the battle, the horror of the siege, and the dehumanizing experience of captivity. Their stories were a warning, a powerful reminder of the profound human cost of war and the terrible price of fanaticism. The aftermath of Stalingrad was a period of profound tragedy, a story of men who had survived a battle only to die in a prison camp, a final, grim testament to the immense human suffering that had consumed the city. The Soviet Union, for its part, used the Stalingrad victory as a powerful tool of propaganda. They broadcast the news of the surrender of the Sixth Army to the world, a clear and unequivocal signal that the war was turning against the Germans. The images of the defeated German soldiers, many of them sick and emaciated, were a powerful and potent symbol of German military failure. The victory at Stalingrad was a profound and symbolic moment for the Soviet people. It was a sign that they could not only withstand the German onslaught, but that they could defeat them. It was a moment of national pride and a moment of national reckoning, a time to mourn the immense casualties that had been suffered and to celebrate the courage and resilience of the Soviet people. The aftermath of Stalingrad was a complex and multifaceted period, a time of both profound celebration and profound tragedy. It was a time to remember the heroes of the battle, and a time to mourn the immense human cost of the victory. The story of Stalingrad was not just a story of a battle, but a story of a nation that had been pushed to the very limits of human endurance and had emerged victorious. The Battle of Stalingrad was not just a victory for the Soviet Union. It was a profound and irreversible turning point in the Second World War. For the first time, the myth of German invincibility was shattered, and the world watched in stunned disbelief as the once unstoppable Wehrmacht was consumed by a single, brutal city. The defeat of the German Sixth Army, one of the most powerful and well-equipped forces in the German military, was a catastrophic and demoralizing blow to the Third Reich. It was a political defeat, a military defeat, and a profound psychological defeat. The German public, which had been fed a steady diet of propaganda and lies, was now faced with the grim reality of a major military disaster. The news of the surrender of Field Marshal Paulus and his army was a profound shock, a moment of national reckoning that would forever be a part of the German psyche. The war, which had seemed so close to a German victory, was now a long, bloody, and uncertain struggle. The tide had turned, and the long, arduous road to Berlin was now open. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad had a profound and immediate impact on the global conflict. It gave a massive boost to the morale of the Allied forces and the populations of the occupied countries. For the first time, people saw that the Germans could be defeated and that the dream of a thousand-year Reich was not an inevitable reality. The victory also had a profound strategic impact. The Germans, having lost a massive army and a large number of their best tanks and soldiers, were now on the defensive. They were forced to divert their resources to the Eastern Front, a decision that would have a profound impact on the war in the West. The Germans were no longer able to launch a massive, coordinated offensive, and they were forced to fight a prolonged, grinding war of attrition, a war that they were destined to lose. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad was not a fluke. It was a testament to the immense power of the Red Army and the unyielding resilience of the Soviet people. It was a clear and unequivocal signal that the Soviet Union was not going to be defeated and that they were now on the offensive. The Battle of Stalingrad also had a profound impact on the relationship between the Allied powers. The British and the Americans, who had been hesitant to open a second front in Europe, now saw that the Soviet Union was a formidable and powerful ally. The victory at Stalingrad gave a new sense of urgency to the Allied war effort, and it led to a more coordinated and more aggressive strategy. The Allies, now confident of a Soviet victory, began to plan a massive invasion of Europe, a plan that would ultimately lead to the end of the war. The victory at Stalingrad was a pivotal moment in the history of the war, a moment that would forever be remembered as the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. The German dream of global domination, which had seemed so close to becoming a reality, was now a distant and fading memory, a cruel and bitter joke. The German war machine, once a juggernaut of lightning-fast conquest, was now mired in a slow, grinding war of attrition, a war that it was destined to lose. The tide had turned, and the long, arduous road to Berlin was now open. The Battle of Stalingrad was the moment that changed everything. It was a battle of profound human suffering and immense human courage, a battle that would forever be remembered as the moment that the world turned against the Third Reich. The German army, once the symbol of a new and terrifying European order, was now a defeated and demoralized force. The Soviet Union, once a nation on the brink of collapse, was now a powerful and victorious nation. The war was far from over, but the final outcome was now known, a certainty etched in the blood and fire of a single, decisive battle. Total word count, 1307. With the decisive victory at Stalingrad, the Soviet Union had seized the strategic initiative, and the German war machine was now on the defensive. But Hitler, blinded by his own hubris and a pathological refusal to accept defeat, was not ready to give up. He was determined to regain the initiative, to land a decisive blow that would once again turn the tide of the war in his favor. His plan was a massive and audacious offensive codenamed Operation Citadel. The objective was to eliminate a massive Soviet salient, a bulge in the front lines around the city of Kursk, and to encircle and destroy the Soviet armies in the region. It was a high-stakes gamble, a final, desperate throw of the dice, and it would lead to the largest tank battle in human history. The German forces, comprised of some of their most powerful and advanced tanks, including the new Panther and Tiger tanks, were a formidable force. They were supported by a massive force of infantry and artillery, and their morale, though battered by the defeat at Stalingrad, was still high. They were confident that they could once again defeat the Red Army and turn the tide of the war. The Soviet High Command, however, was no longer the disorganized and unprepared force it had been at the beginning of the war. They had learned the lessons of Stalingrad, and they were now a confident, well-organized, and formidable military force. They had a massive intelligence network that had infiltrated the German command, and they knew the details of Operation Citadel long before it was launched. They had months to prepare for the German offensive, and they had turned the Kursk salient into an intricate and deadly fortress. They had built a series of deeply entrenched defensive positions, with multiple layers of trenches, anti-tank ditches, minefields, and artillery emplacements. They had amassed a massive force of tanks, artillery, and infantry, and they were prepared to meet the German onslaught head-on. The Battle of Kursk was not a battle of maneuver, but a battle of attrition, a massive, bloody struggle that would be decided by the sheer force of numbers and the unyielding will of the soldiers who fought it. The German offensive began on July 5, 1943, and it was a massive and coordinated assault. The German tanks, led by the powerful Tiger and Panther tanks, tore through the Soviet minefields and defensive lines. The fighting was fierce and relentless, a chaotic and brutal clash of steel and fire. The Soviet forces, though they had been preparing for months, were pushed back by the ferocity of the German attack. But the German advance was slow and costly, and they were suffering immense casualties. The Soviet anti-tank guns and artillery, now in deeply entrenched positions, were a deadly and effective force. The Soviet tanks, the new and formidable T-34s, fought with a fierce determination, and they were a match for the German tanks. The battle was a meat grinder, a relentless and brutal struggle that was consuming men and machines at an unimaginable rate. The German forces, though they were a formidable force, were slowly but surely being bled white by the relentless Soviet resistance. The turning point of the battle came at the Battle of Prokhorovka, a massive clash of tanks that would forever be remembered as the largest tank battle in human history. The German forces, in a desperate attempt to break through the Soviet defenses, launched a massive tank assault on the Soviet lines. The Soviet forces, in a display of heroic courage and suicidal determination, met the German attack head-on. The two sides clashed in a chaotic and brutal melee of tanks, a scene of fire, smoke, and death. The fighting was so close that the tanks were often firing at each other at point-blank range. The battle was a horrific and costly affair for both sides, but it was a decisive Soviet victory. The German forces, having suffered immense casualties, were forced to retreat. The Battle of Kursk was a complete and utter failure for the Germans. They had lost a massive number of their best tanks and soldiers, and they had failed to regain the initiative. The Soviet victory at Kursk was a clear and unequivocal signal that the tide of the war had turned, and that the long, arduous road to Berlin was now a certainty. The German dream of a thousand-year Reich was now a distant and fading memory, and the story of Stalingrad was not a fluke, but the beginning of the end. With the catastrophic failure of Operation Citadel and the crushing defeat at Kursk, the German war machine was irrevocably on the defensive. The Red Army, now confident and formidable, had seized the strategic initiative and would not relinquish it. The nature of the war on the Eastern Front changed from one of German offensive thrusts to a relentless, grinding Soviet advance. This was a slow, methodical, and unimaginably bloody campaign, a continuous westward march that would push the German forces out of Soviet territory and, ultimately, into the heart of the Third Reich. The Red Army, a massive force of millions of men, was now a powerful and well-equipped military. Its leadership, hardened by the brutal lessons of Stalingrad and Kursk, was now a skilled and confident force, and they were prepared to fight a prolonged war of attrition. The Germans, on the other hand, were a defeated and demoralized force. They were suffering from a lack of men, equipment, and resources, and their morale, once so high, was now at an all-time low. They were fighting a desperate rearguard action, a slow and agonizing retreat that would last for years. The Soviet offensive was a series of massive, coordinated assaults, a relentless westward push that would not be stopped. The Red Army, with its overwhelming numerical and technological superiority, tore through the German defensive lines. The fighting was fierce and relentless, a brutal and costly struggle for every inch of ground. The Germans, though they fought with a grim determination, were simply no match for the sheer power and numbers of the Soviet forces. The Soviet forces, now fighting on their own soil, were filled with a fierce desire for retribution. They were fighting to liberate their country, to avenge the millions of people who had been killed, and to punish the men who had brought such devastation to their land. The war had become a personal and emotional struggle, a brutal and unforgiving campaign that would leave a trail of death and destruction in its wake. The German soldiers, now fighting a losing battle, were a broken and demoralized force, and they were suffering from the psychological and emotional trauma of a prolonged and brutal war. The dream of a thousand-year Reich, which had seemed so close just a few years before, was now a distant and fading memory, a cruel and bitter joke. The slow grind to the west was a testament to the immense human cost of the war. The Soviet forces, though they were winning, were also suffering immense casualties. The battles were often prolonged and bloody affairs, with both sides suffering immense losses. The German forces, though they were a defeated force, were still a formidable and dangerous enemy, and they were prepared to fight to the last man. The fighting was often brutal and unforgiving, and the war was a constant source of profound human suffering. The German retreat was not an orderly one, but a chaotic and desperate flight from a powerful and vengeful enemy. The German soldiers, many of them frostbitten and starving, were forced to abandon their equipment and their wounded, and they were often surrounded and destroyed by the relentless Soviet advance. The retreat was a grim and terrible spectacle, a final, tragic footnote to a dream that had turned into a living nightmare. The long, arduous road to Berlin was a road paved with blood and fire, a path that led inexorably to the final, cataclysmic conclusion of the war. The German war machine, once a juggernaut of lightning-fast conquest, was now mired in a slow, grinding war of attrition, a war that it was destined to lose. The slow grind to the west was a profound and irreversible turning point in the war. The German forces were on the run, and the Soviet Union was on the offensive. The dream of a thousand-year Reich was now a distant and fading memory, a cruel and bitter joke. The story of Stalingrad was not a fluke, but the beginning of the end. The Battle of Stalingrad had shattered the myth of German invincibility, and the Battle of Kursk had sealed their fate. The long, bloody, and arduous road to Berlin was now a certainty, and the world was watching in awe as the Soviet Union, a nation that had been on the brink of collapse, was now a powerful and victorious nation. The war was far from over, but the final outcome was now known, a certainty etched in the blood and fire of a single, decisive battle. As the Red Army relentlessly pushed westward, the reality of impending defeat became undeniable for most of the German high command. Yet, in his bunker in Berlin, Adolf Hitler remained trapped in a world of his own making, a distorted reality fueled by a pathological refusal to accept a single setback. The defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk were not, in his mind, the result of strategic blunders or a powerful enemy, but a series of betrayals and incompetence from his own generals. He became increasingly paranoid, distrustful of his military advisors, and more convinced that only his own will could save the Third Reich from collapse. His decisions became more erratic, more irrational, and more detached from the grim realities on the ground. He would order armies that no longer existed to attack enemy flanks that were now miles behind his lines. He would redraw maps with a frantic intensity, moving imaginary armies and creating fantastical counteroffensives that had no hope of success. His final days were a tragic and pathetic spectacle of a man consumed by his own delusions, a man who had once held the fate of the world in his hands, now a broken and defeated figure, trapped in a subterranean bunker, a prisoner of his own mind. Hitler's final military directives were a series of catastrophic blunders that only hastened the end of the war. He refused to allow his generals to conduct a strategic retreat, to shorten their lines, and to consolidate their forces. He ordered them to hold every inch of ground, to fight to the last man, a tactic that resulted in the senseless and immense loss of life. He would berate his generals for their failures, accuse them of cowardice and betrayal, and he would often fly into a rage, screaming and pounding his fists on the table. The men who had once been his most loyal and trusted advisors were now objects of his scorn and his contempt. The German army, a force that had been a testament to discipline and organization, was now a chaotic and disorganized mess, its leaders often paralyzed by fear of their own commander. The German dream of a thousand-year Reich was now a fading memory, a cruel and bitter joke that was being consumed by the man who had created it. Hitler, in his final days, was a man consumed by his own delusions, a man who had brought a nation to its knees and was now leading it to its final, cataclysmic conclusion. The German people, who had once been so loyal and so confident in their leader, were now beginning to question everything they had been told. The news of the immense casualties, the constant retreats, and the Allied bombing of their cities had taken a heavy toll on their morale. They were suffering from a lack of food, a lack of resources, and a profound sense of hopelessness. The dream of a new and glorious Germany had vanished, replaced by the grim reality of a defeated and occupied nation. The war, which had started with such confidence and such hope, was now a long, bloody, and tragic affair. Hitler, in his final days, was a man who had lost the support of his people, the trust of his military, and the respect of his allies. He was a man who had led a nation to its ultimate destruction, a final and terrible act of self-destruction. The final days of the Third Reich were a tragic and pathetic spectacle, a grim and silent testament to the immense human cost of fanaticism and the profound dangers of a single man's delusions. The Battle of Stalingrad, which had been the beginning of the end for the German war machine, was now a distant and fading memory, a grim and silent reminder of the profound dangers of a leader who was unwilling to accept defeat. The war was now a foregone conclusion, and the only question was when and how it would end. The final, cataclysmic conclusion was now a certainty, and the world was watching in awe and in horror as the German dream of a thousand-year Reich was consumed by the very man who had created it. The story of Stalingrad was not a fluke, but the beginning of the end, a profound and irreversible turning point that would forever change the course of human history. While the brutal, grinding war on the Eastern Front slowly but surely consumed the German war machine, a new and powerful force was being assembled in the West. The Allied powers, with the decisive Soviet victory at Stalingrad and Kursk, were now confident of a German defeat. They had been planning for months, and on June 6, 1944, they launched Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in human history. The Allied forces, a massive armada of ships and planes, stormed the beaches of Normandy, France, in a massive and coordinated assault. The invasion was a difficult and bloody affair, with the German defenders fighting with a fierce determination. But the Allied forces, with their overwhelming numerical and technological superiority, were able to break through the German defenses and establish a beachhead. The war in the West had begun, and the Germans were now fighting a two-front war, a struggle that they were destined to lose. The Allied invasion of Normandy was a profound and irreversible turning point in the war, a moment that would forever be remembered as the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. The Allied forces, under the command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, were a powerful and well-equipped force. They were a multinational army, with soldiers from the United States, Great Britain, Canada, and a host of other Allied nations. Their morale was high, their belief in their cause was absolute, and they were determined to liberate Europe from the tyranny of the Third Reich. The German forces, on the other hand, were a defeated and demoralized force. They were fighting a defensive war, and they were suffering from a lack of men, equipment, and resources. They were also being relentlessly bombed by the Allied air forces, a constant and terrible threat that was devastating their cities and their industrial base. The Allied advance was a slow, grinding affair, with the German defenders fighting with a fierce determination. The fighting was often brutal and unforgiving, and the war was a constant source of profound human suffering. The German dream of a thousand-year Reich was now a fading memory, a cruel and bitter joke that was being consumed by the relentless Allied advance. The Allied invasion of Normandy was a moment of profound symbolism and a moment of profound strategic importance. It was a clear and unequivocal signal that the war was turning against the Germans, and that they were now fighting a losing battle. The Germans, with their forces stretched thin on both the eastern and western fronts, were unable to mount a sustained counteroffensive. They were forced to fight a prolonged, grinding war of attrition, a war that they were destined to lose. The Allied victory at Normandy was a testament to the immense power of the Allied war machine and the unyielding resilience of the Allied soldiers. It was a moment that would forever be remembered as the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. The German war machine, once a juggernaut of lightning-fast conquest, was now mired in a slow, grinding war of attrition, a war that it was destined to lose. The long, arduous road to Berlin was now a certainty, and the world was watching in awe as the Allied forces, a powerful and victorious coalition, were on the offensive. The story of Stalingrad was not a fluke, but the beginning of the end, a profound and irreversible turning point that would forever change the course of human history. The Allied Western Front was a testament to the immense human cost of the war, a long, bloody, and arduous campaign that would last for months. The battles were often brutal and unforgiving, and the war was a constant source of profound human suffering. The Allied soldiers, though they were winning, were also suffering immense casualties, and they were faced with a determined and fanatical enemy that was willing to fight to the last man. The war was a brutal and dehumanizing experience, and it left an indelible mark on the memories of all who participated in it. The story of the Allied Western Front was a story of profound courage, immense sacrifice, and a final, heroic push to liberate Europe from the tyranny of the Third Reich. The long and arduous road to Berlin, paved with the blood and fire of the Eastern and Western fronts, was now reaching its final, cataclysmic conclusion. The German dream of a thousand-year Reich, once a terrifying reality, was now a distant and fading memory. The Red Army, a massive and powerful force of millions of men, was now on the outskirts of Berlin, and the battle for the city, the final and most brutal chapter of the war, was about to begin. The German forces, a chaotic and disorganized mix of regular army soldiers, Volkssturm, civilian militia, and Hitler Youth, were a defeated and demoralized force. They were fighting a defensive war, a desperate rearguard action to protect their capital from the relentless Soviet onslaught. The city of Berlin, once a symbol of German power and ambition, was now a smoking ruin, a landscape of twisted metal and shattered buildings. The Allied bombing of the city had left it in ruins, and the final Soviet assault would turn it into a hellish, urban nightmare. The Battle of Berlin, in April and May of 1945, was a grim and terrible spectacle, a final, tragic footnote to a war of unimaginable brutality. The Soviet assault on Berlin was a massive and coordinated attack. The Red Army, with its overwhelming numerical and technological superiority, launched a furious and relentless assault on the city. The fighting was fierce and relentless, a brutal and costly struggle for every inch of ground. The German defenders, though they fought with a grim determination, were simply no match for the sheer power and numbers of the Soviet forces. The Soviet artillery, a constant and terrible presence, pounded the city into rubble, and the Soviet tanks, the new and formidable T-34s, tore through the German defenses. The fighting was often close quarters and brutal, a war fought in the sewers and basements, in the shattered ruins of buildings, and in the maze of trenches and foxholes that crisscrossed the city. The German soldiers, many of them young and inexperienced, were a broken and demoralized force, and they were suffering from the psychological and emotional trauma of a prolonged and brutal war. The dream of a 1,000-year Reich, which had seemed so close just a few years before, was now a distant and fading memory, a cruel and bitter joke that was being consumed by the man who had created it. In his subterranean bunker, Adolf Hitler, the architect of a nightmare, was now a broken and defeated figure. He was a man consumed by his own delusions, a man who had led a nation to its ultimate destruction. He continued to order armies that no longer existed to attack enemy flanks, and he would often fly into a rage, screaming and pounding his fists on the table. He was a man who had lost the support of his people, the trust of his military, and the respect of his allies. He was a man who had brought a nation to its knees and was now leading it to its final, cataclysmic conclusion. On April 30th, 1945, as the Soviet forces closed in on his bunker, Hitler, in a final act of self-destruction, committed suicide. His death, though it did not immediately end the war, was a profound and symbolic moment. It was a clear and unequivocal signal that the war was over, that the German dream of a 1,000-year Reich was now a distant and fading memory, a cruel and bitter joke. The Battle of Berlin, a final, brutal chapter in a war of unimaginable brutality, was now coming to a close. The fall of Berlin was a moment of profound symbolism and a moment of profound strategic importance. It was a clear and unequivocal signal that the war was over, and that the German dream of global domination was now a distant and fading memory. The German war machine, once a juggernaut of lightning-fast conquest, was now a defeated and demoralized force. The Soviet Union, a nation that had been on the brink of collapse, was now a powerful and victorious nation. The war was far from over, but the final outcome was now known, a certainty etched in the blood and fire of a single, decisive battle. The surrender of Germany on May 8, 1945, was a moment of profound celebration and a moment of profound tragedy. The war in Europe was finally over, but the immense human cost of the conflict would echo through the decades, a grim reminder of the immense suffering that had been inflicted. The story of Stalingrad, the tiny provincial city that had become the epicenter of a global conflict, was now complete, but its lessons would forever be a part of the human story. The brutal winter that had devoured the Third Reich's dream was not a fluke, but a powerful and profound symbol of the unyielding resilience of the human spirit and the profound dangers of a leader who was unwilling to accept defeat. The German dream of a 1,000-year Reich was now a distant and fading memory, a cruel and bitter joke that was being consumed by the very man who had created it. The war was now over, but its legacy would echo through the decades, a grim reminder of the immense human cost of war and a testament to the unyielding spirit of those who fought to defend their beliefs. The defeat of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad was not just a military defeat. It was a profound and irreversible psychological defeat. It shattered the myth of German invincibility, and it gave a massive boost to the morale of the Allied forces and the populations of the occupied countries. For the first time, people saw that the Germans could be defeated, and that the dream of a thousand-year Reich was not an inevitable reality. The victory also had a profound strategic impact. The Germans, having lost a massive army and a large number of their best tanks and soldiers, were now on the defensive. They were forced to divert their resources to the Eastern Front, a decision that would have a profound impact on the war in the West. The Germans were no longer able to launch a massive, coordinated offensive, and they were forced to fight a prolonged, grinding war of attrition, a war that they were destined to lose. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad was not a fluke. It was a testament to the immense power of the Red Army and the unyielding resilience of the Soviet people. The story of Stalingrad is a story of profound human suffering and immense human courage. It is a story of a city that was pushed to the very limits of human endurance and had emerged victorious. It is a story of men who fought and died for their beliefs, and a story of a nation that was forever changed by the experience. The legacy of Stalingrad is a complex and multifaceted one. It is a story of a brutal and dehumanizing war, a war that left a trail of death and destruction in its wake. But it is also a story of a city that had become a symbol of hope and defiance, a city that had refused to be defeated. The story of Stalingrad is a story that demands to be remembered, not to glorify war, but to understand it, and to honor the memory of those who lived and died in its shadow. The unending winter of Stalingrad was not a fluke, but a powerful and profound symbol of the unyielding resilience of the human spirit and the profound dangers of a leader who was unwilling to accept defeat. The war was now over, but its legacy would echo through the decades, a grim reminder of the immense human cost of war and a testament to the unyielding spirit of those who fought to defend their beliefs. The world had watched in awe as the German juggernaut had conquered Europe, and now it watched in disbelief as it was consumed by a single, brutal city. The story of Stalingrad was a story of a dream that was devoured by the relentless, merciless jaws of winter. The long and arduous road to Berlin was a road paved with blood and fire, a path that led inexorably to the final, cataclysmic conclusion of the war. The war was now over, but its legacy would echo through the decades, a grim reminder of the immense human cost of war and a testament to the unyielding spirit of those who fought to defend their beliefs. The story of Stalingrad, the tiny provincial city that had become the epicenter of a global conflict, was now complete, but its lessons would forever be a part of the human story. The smoke of battle has long since cleared from the shattered streets of Stalingrad, and the ghosts of 250,000 men whisper on the winds. The story of Stalingrad is more than a chronicle of a single battle. It is a timeless and profound epic of human endeavor, a stark reflection on the nature of destiny and the price of victory. In the cold, grim determination of General Vasily Chukov and his defenders, we see the enduring power of a people fighting for their very existence. In the tireless work of the Soviet command, we find a testament to the strategic brilliance that can turn the tide of a global conflict. The unyielding bravery of the German soldiers, who fought with a grim determination in the face of certain death, reminds us of the terrible human cost of fanaticism and the immense power of a single, delusional man. Stalingrad stands as a grim and silent monument not just to a single battle, but to the end of a terrifying dream and the beginning of a new world order. It was the decisive turning point that forever shattered the myth of German invincibility, a battle where the pride of the Wehrmacht was consumed by the brutal combination of human resilience, a formidable military, and the merciless fury of the Russian winter. The German dream of a thousand-year Reich, which had seemed so close to becoming a reality, was now a distant and fading memory, a cruel and bitter joke that was being consumed by the very man who had created it. The war in Europe, which had started with a swift, brutal blitzkrieg, found its true resolution not on the beaches of Normandy, but on the banks of the Volga River. It was a conflict born of hubris and ended by a combination of human ingenuity, courage, and a powerful, unrelenting will to survive. Today, as we stand in an era of global connectivity and digital warfare, the lessons of Stalingrad are more relevant than ever. The silent war of intelligence, the importance of strategic foresight, and the unpredictable nature of human courage are all timeless themes that resonate with us still. The men who fought at Stalingrad, and in the battles that followed, are a link to a past that, while distant, remains a crucial part of our shared story. They were a generation that stared into the abyss of total war and found within themselves the strength to endure, to fight, and to ultimately triumph. Their sacrifice paved the way for the world we know today, a world that, for all its flaws, has been spared the kind of global conflict that once threatened to consume it. The story of Stalingrad is not just a lesson in military history. It is a lesson in humanity itself, a profound and sobering reminder of what we are capable of, for better or for worse. It is a story that demands to be remembered, not to glorify war, but to understand it, and to honor the memory of those who lived and died in its shadow.